A whisper of a plea, barely audible, snagged Julian Croft at the base of the grand staircase. "Please, don't make me go back. I'll try to be better." The voice belonged to his 6-year-old son, Leo, small and trembling. A woman's reply, sharp as shattered ice, sliced through the cavernous foyer. "Better? You don't know the meaning of the word, you clumsy little brat. Maybe if your mother hadn't spoiled you rotten, you wouldn't be so utterly useless." The words struck Julian with physical force. The gift bag in his hand, holding a meticulously crafted model rocket for Leo, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. His fingers went numb, and the bag slipped, landing with a soft thud on the marble floor. For a disorienting second, the only sounds were the solemn ticking of the grandfather clock and the frantic, percussive beat of his own heart. He wasn't supposed to be here. A board meeting in San Francisco had ended hours ahead of schedule, and for the first time in months, he'd canceled his subsequent engagements, boarded his jet, and flown home, dreaming of surprising his son. Now, the only thing that mattered was the strained voice of his child, trapped somewhere behind a closed door. Another sound followed, a sickening crash, a choked gasp, and then a profound, terrifying silence. Julian's feet were moving before his mind could issue a command. He ascended the last few steps into the main hall and veered down the corridor, his polished shoes silent on the thick Persian runner. The door to the family living room was ajar, a sliver of light cutting through the dim hallway. Through that narrow opening, he witnessed a scene that would forever be seared into his memory. Caroline, his wife of 18 months, stood over Leo, her body taut with a rage that seemed to vibrate in the air around her. One of her stiletto heels was planted firmly on something small and wooden, the wing of the model airplane Leo had spent the last week building. It splintered under her weight. Leo was huddled on the floor, a book clutched in one hand, while his other arm was thrown over his face as if to ward off a blow. "Look at the mess you've made, you little monster," Caroline hissed, gesturing to a spilled glass of juice on the antique rug. "That rug is worth more than every toy you own." Julian shoved the door open. The heavy oak slammed against the wall, the sound booming through the room like a gunshot, startling them both. "Caroline!" She spun around, her fury dissolving in an instant, replaced by a mask of wide-eyed, theatrical surprise. "Julian! Oh my goodness, you're home! I didn't hear you come in." He didn't respond. His entire focus was on Leo, who hadn't moved from his spot on the floor. One of the boy's crutches, the one he'd needed since the accident, lay beside him. The carbon fiber shaft snapped cleanly in two. The other had been tossed across the room, resting near the fireplace. Leo's cheeks were pale, streaked with the tracks of silent tears. Without a single word to his wife, Julian strode past her and knelt beside his son. "Leo, are you hurt?" The boy tried to push himself up, his face contorting in a wince. I was just getting my book," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "She said I was too slow." "He spilled juice all over the rug and almost knocked over a priceless vase," Caroline interjected, her tone sharp and defensive. "I raised my voice, that's all. You know how uncoordinated he is with those things." Julian's jaw tightened into a knot of granite. He reached out and picked up the broken crutch. It hadn't broken in a fall. The clean snap was indicative of a direct, forceful impact. It had been stomped on. "Did you touch him?" His voice was unnervingly calm, cold as the marble beneath his knees. Caroline let out a brittle, disbelieving laugh. "Are you serious? Of course not. I might have steadied his shoulder, but honestly, Julian, he's being overly dramatic." "I'm asking you again," he repeated, his voice dropping lower. He stood up, the shattered crutch held loosely in his hand like a piece of damning evidence. "Did you put your hands on my son?" Don't be absurd, Julian. She crossed her arms over her chest, a portrait of indignant innocence. He made a mess. I reprimanded him. That is what a parent does. He is 6 years old. He is manipulative, she countered, pointing a finger at the small boy on the floor. He uses that leg of his to get whatever he wants. He knows exactly what he's doing. Go upstairs, Julian said flatly, his gaze fixed on Leo's frightened face. What? I said, go. Now. I am your wife, she snapped, her voice rising. You don't give me orders as if I were… He finally turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a low burning fire that was far more terrifying than any shout. Caroline, do not make me say it again. There was something in his tone, a core of tempered steel, a tightly controlled fury on the verge of breaking its leash, that made her take an involuntary step back. With a dismissive scoff, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the room, her angry footsteps echoing down the hall. When the sound of a door slamming shut reverberated through the house, Julian turned his attention back to Leo, who was still trembling. Tell me what really happened, buddy. Leo hesitated, his eyes darting from the door to his father's face. She yells a lot, he finally admitted in a small voice, but only when you're not here. She says, Mommy was weak. Julian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Amelia, his first wife, had fought her illness with a strength that had humbled everyone around her. She had spent her final days recording messages for Leo, reading him stories until her voice gave out, her love a fierce, unwavering light, until the very end. She says, I'm broken. Just like Mommy was, Leo whispered, the words nearly lost in the oppressive silence of the room. Julian knelt and gathered his son into his arms, holding him with a gentleness that belied the storm raging inside him. You are not broken, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You are perfect. You are the strongest boy I have ever known, and I am so sorry. Leo nodded against his father's chest, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had just been turned upside down. Later that night, long after Leo was settled in his bed with a temporary brace on his ankle and a new set of custom crutches ordered for rush delivery, Julian retreated to his office. He pulled up the interface for the estate's comprehensive security system. Every camera feed, every angle from the past week had been meticulously erased. The activity logs were blank, and even the off-site cloud backup had been wiped clean. He opened a deep drawer in his mahogany desk and pulled out a file labeled simply, Amelia. He sifted through the contents until he found what he was looking for. Her medical file. It was gone. The folder was empty. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled in his chest. There had been signs, he realized now, 100 tiny red flags he had dismissed. Leo's sudden aversion to being left alone with Caroline, the way he would flinch if she moved too quickly, the constant, plausible explanations she always had for small bruises or misplaced belongings. Julian had chalked it all up to grief, to the difficult adjustment of a new family dynamic. He had been a fool. Julian Croft was a man who had built an empire on logic, on data, on anticipating his opponent's every move. But this wasn't business. This was a war declared on his own home front, and he would excavate every lie Caroline had ever told, even if the truth threatened to shatter the very foundations of his world. The sun bled across the Malibu sky, painting the polished floors of Julian's master suite in shades of gold and crimson. He stood by the expansive window, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, his jaw a rigid line of tension. The rhythmic crash of waves on the cliffs below usually soothed him, but tonight The sound was a mocking reminder of the storm inside his own house. Behind him, Leo was propped up on a mountain of pillows, his injured leg carefully elevated. His new crutches were scheduled to arrive first thing in the morning, but for now, he was still, quietly turning the pages of a well-loved picture book. One small hand idly traced the outline of the silver locket he wore, a final gift from his mother. Julian turned from the window. "How's the pain, buddy?" Leo offered a slight nod. "It's just a little achy. I'm okay." "You don't have to be okay for my sake." Leo hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "I know." Julian sat on the edge of the bed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Did she ever hurt you before today?" The boy didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the illustrated scales of a dragon before he gently closed the book. "Not like that," he said, his voice barely audible. "But sometimes she'd push me, or she'd hide my crutches if I wasn't moving fast enough for her." A wave of nausea churned in Julian's stomach. He had trusted Caroline, not with the blind faith of a naive man, but with the measured belief that she would, at the very least, care for his son. She had entered his life in the desolate aftermath of Amelia's death, a vision of elegance, poise, and profound sympathy. She had been his confidant during sleepless nights, his companion during Leo's difficult physical therapy sessions. She had even started growing lavender in the garden because Amelia had loved its scent. It had all been an exquisitely crafted illusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice thick with a grief he thought he had already processed. "She said if I told you, you'd send me away," Leo mumbled, his eyes fixed on the bedspread. "She said you didn't really want me after Mommy died, that you only kept me because you had to." Julian closed his eyes, the rage from earlier solidifying into something colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. "I will never, ever send you away," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "You are the most important thing in my life, Leo. Nothing she says can ever change that." Leo looked up at him then, his eyes large and glassy with unshed tears. "Promise?" "I swear it." A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant cries of gulls. Then, so softly Julian almost missed it, Leo added, "She doesn't like it when I talk about Mommy." Julian's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "She says Mommy was selfish for getting sick, that if she really loved us, she would have fought harder." Julian shot to his feet, the sudden movement causing the mattress to bounce. He turned away, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Amelia hadn't given up. She had endured grueling chemotherapy, surgeries that stole her strength, and pain that would have broken lesser people. And through it all, she had smiled for Leo, read him stories, and left behind a box of letters for every birthday she would never get to see. She had faced death with a grace that Caroline could never comprehend. Later that night, after Leo had finally drifted off to sleep, Julian poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in his study, staring at the blank security feed on his laptop. The system hadn't just been wiped, it had been professionally scrubbed. He hadn't been paying close enough attention, but now the timeline was damning. The data had been erased 3 days ago, just after he'd left for his business trip. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the amber liquid. This was no longer about anger. It was about strategy. He needed to employ the same cold, meticulous calculus that had made him a titan of the tech industry. Caroline had mistaken his grief for weakness. She had underestimated him. He was no longer a man in mourning. He was a hunter. He unlocked a drawer in his desk and pulled out a black binder labeled Amelia, Medical. He flipped through the pages. Doctor's notes, prescription schedules, Hospice reports. Tucked at the very back was something he hadn't looked at in over a year. A sealed envelope with Amelia's elegant script on the front. For Julian, if things ever feel wrong. She had given it to him just weeks before she passed, making him promise not to open it unless he had a reason to doubt the narrative of her decline. He tore it open. Inside was a single handwritten page. Her penmanship was shaky, but the words were clear. Julian, my love, if you are reading this, it means my intuition was right. I know how easy it is to be deceived by a mask of kindness. I never wanted to sow seeds of doubt, but I felt something was off with Caroline. She was too attentive, too interested in my medication regimen. I once found her preparing my evening tea when the nurse had already done so. She claimed she was just trying to help me rest. I let it go, telling myself it was paranoia. But if I am gone, and something doesn't feel right, I am begging you to look deeper. For Leo's sake. For us. Amelia. His blood ran cold. Caroline had always insisted on preparing Amelia's evening tea. He looked back at the medical records. In the final 3 weeks of Amelia's life, her cognitive function had plummeted at a rate that had baffled her doctors. A nurse had noted the anomaly, but the official report had attributed it to natural complications of the disease. Fate. Julian rose and walked to the window, the forgotten whiskey sitting on his desk. The moon cast a silver path across the dark ocean. Leo deserved a safe home. Amelia deserved justice. And he was done being blind. He returned to his desk and began to make a list, his pen scratching across the paper with grim purpose. Names, dates, objectives. At the bottom, he wrote a single line in bold, decisive letters. Find the truth, no matter the cost. The morning that followed was unnervingly still. Julian sat alone at the vast oak dining table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in his hands. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic breathing of Leo sleeping peacefully upstairs. Caroline entered the kitchen, her movements precise and controlled. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe knot, her makeup immaculate, but the faint shadows beneath her eyes spoke of a restless night. She went directly to the refrigerator, retrieved a bottle of cold-pressed juice, and opened it with a sharp twist. Julian didn't look at her. You erased the security footage. She paused for a fraction of a second before taking a long sip. I have no idea what you're talking about. I checked the system logs. The footage from the past 3 days was wiped, along with the cloud backups. That requires an administrator's password. You can't. Perhaps it was a system malfunction, she said, her voice a study in nonchalance. I run a multi-billion-dollar tech security firm. Do you really think I can't tell the difference between a glitch and a manual override? At last, she turned to face him, one perfectly sculpted eyebrow raised in challenge. You're upset. I understand that. But let's not invent a conspiracy where there isn't one. You abused my son. A flicker of something cold and hard passed through Caroline's eyes. Your son, not mine, remember? Julian rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, each one imbued with a chilling sense of finality. He was 6 months old when his mother died. You have been the only maternal figure in his life since then. That is the role you claimed you wanted. I didn't sign up to be a full-time nursemaid to a... she began, the venomous words escaping before she could stop them. They hung in the air between them, toxic and irrefutable. Julian's jaw clenched, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. Get out. She blinked, momentarily stunned. What? You no longer live here. If you want to contest this, you can do so through your lawyer. But I want you out of this house before Leo wakes up. Her mouth opened and closed silently. She took another sip of her juice, buying a moment to regain her composure, then sneered. You were always so sentimental. Just like Amelia. So trusting. So naive. A block of ice formed in Julian's chest. What did you just say? She smiled then, a slow, cruel curve of her lips. She didn't just die from the illness, you know. She was weak, exhausted. In the end, she welcomed it. He took a step toward her, his entire 6'3" frame radiating a fury that was barely contained. What did you do to her? Caroline laughed, a soft, chilling sound. Prove it. Bater, and with that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking a sharp, defiant rhythm on the tile floor, leaving behind the faint scent of citrus and poison. Later that day, Julian took Leo to his appointment with Dr. Evans, a pediatric therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. Dr. Evans was a gentle, soft-spoken man in his 50s, with kind eyes that seemed to see more than most. While Leo was engaged in an art activity in the adjoining playroom, the therapist sat across from Julian in his sunlit office. I'm glad you came in, Dr. Evans said. I've noticed a growing tension in Leo's behavior for months. It's in his drawings, his posture, the way he avoids any discussion of his home life. Julian leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. He told me things last night. About Caroline. About the things she says to him. The way she threatens him. She even told him his mother was weak for dying. The therapist's expression darkened. I suspected emotional abuse, but without any disclosure from Leo, my hands were tied. He's a very bright boy, but he's also very protective, even of those who are hurting him. I need to protect him now, Julian said, his voice cracking with emotion, but I don't know where to start. Dr. Evans nodded slowly. There is something else. I've debated whether to bring this up, but given the circumstances. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thin file. Amelia came to see me, privately, about 2 months before she passed away. She was worried. She said Caroline had become overly involved in her care, insisting on mixing her supplements, suggesting changes to her medication schedule. Julian's heart felt as if it had dropped into his stomach. Why didn't you tell me? She swore me to confidentiality. She wasn't sure if it was her own paranoia or a side effect of her treatment. But she left this with me. He handed Julian a small sealed envelope. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. Amelia's. He opened it. Dr. Evans, if anything should happen to me, and if Julian ever comes to you with questions, please give him this note. I don't want to believe it, but I need someone else to know, just in case. Caroline watches me too closely. She handles my medication bottles when she thinks I'm not looking. Once, she brought me a pre-steeped tea that tasted wrong. Maybe I'm just losing my mind, but if I'm not, please don't let her get near Leo. Julian's hands trembled as he folded the letter and slid it into his jacket pocket. She knew, he whispered. Dr. Evans nodded. I believe she did. If you like, I can refer you to a legal child advocate, someone who can help you navigate the custody process without frightening Leo. Julian stood up. Thank you, but I have my own legal team. What I need now is irrefutable proof. He turned to look through the one-way glass into the playroom. Leo was sitting at a small table, meticulously painting a butterfly with vibrant blue wings. He happened to look up at that moment and saw his father's reflection. A small, hesitant smile touched his lips. Julian smiled back, but his eyes burned with a new and terrible resolve. Amelia had left him a map. Leo had survived in silence for longer than any child should have to. And Caroline, who had played the part of the grieving widow's savior so perfectly, was about to find out that the game was over. Julian Croft was just getting started. 3 days later, Julian found himself in the sterile, hushed corridor of St. Jude's Medical Center, a place he hadn't set foot in since the night Amelia had drawn her last breath. The scent of antiseptic and laundered linens was a ghost that clawed at his memory. Amelia's faint smile from the hospital bed, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, Leo's small hand clutching his. He had avoided this place for a reason, but now the past was his only path forward. A young nurse with a kind face approached him, a tablet in her hand. "Mr. Croft, I was told you were coming. You're here for your late wife's medical archives?" "Yes. I need the complete hospice records, medication logs, staff rotas, visitor logs, everything from her final 2 weeks." The nurse nodded, though a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. "I can take you to the records department, but I should warn you, many of the older files were moved to deep storage last year. Not everything has been digitized." Julian followed her through a set of double doors and down a dimly lit hallway into a small, windowless room lined with towering metal filing cabinets. A single computer hummed on a cluttered desk. "Her files should be under A. Croft, Oncology," she said. "I'll give you some privacy. Just press the call button if you need assistance." When she was gone, Julian took a slow, steadying breath and began his search. He located Amelia's file, a thick manila folder bulging with over a year's worth of paperwork. He opened it to the final entries. On the surface, everything appeared to be in order. But Julian had spent 2 decades scrutinizing contracts, looking for the hidden clauses and silent traps buried in dense legalese. He wasn't looking for noise, he was looking for a pattern. He turned to the medication charts: morphine, anti-nausea drugs, vitamin supplements. Then he saw it. On 3 separate nights during her final week, a new medication had been logged: lorazepam. Julian frowned. That drug had never been part of her prescribed treatment, especially not at that dosage. He scanned the entries for the administering nurse's initials. Twice, the initials read C.W., Caroline Williams. She had signed off on the administration of a controlled substance. She wasn't a licensed medical professional. She wasn't even on staff. He quickly found the visitor logs. Most of the names were familiar. His own, Leo's nanny, Dr. Evans. But there it was again, in Caroline's looping, cursive script. Caroline Williams, Family Care Proxy. He had never signed such a document. A cold dread snaked its way up his spine. If Caroline had been operating under a false authority to administer powerful sedatives to his dying wife. He pulled out his phone and began taking pictures of every single page. Just then, the door creaked open. A man in a tailored beige suit stepped inside. He was not hospital staff. He was in his early 40s, with a polished veneer and a tan that spoke of golf courses, not construction sites. "Mr. Croft?" the man asked. Julian remained still. "Yes. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm legal counsel for Ms. Caroline Williams." Julian raised an eyebrow. "She sent you." Arthur offered a thin, professional smile. "Let's just say there's a concern that you are attempting to access personal medical records that are no longer within your purview." Julian let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "She's worried." "Good. That's a start." Arthur's expression remained unchanged. "Mr. Croft, I would advise you to proceed with caution. You don't want to embroil yourself in a legal battle that could spiral out of control. Think of your son, the media, your reputation." "You think of yours," Julian retorted, his voice like ice. because the woman you're representing may have poisoned a terminally ill woman and is now abusing her child. If you choose to remain on this case, I hope you have a strong stomach." Arthur's mouth opened, then closed. He gave a curt nod, turned, and left. When the door clicked shut, Julian pulled out the copy of Amelia's letter, the one from Dr. Evans's office. Her warning was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. Back at his estate that evening, Julian spread the photographed files across his dining room table. He called Marcus Thorne, a private investigator he'd used for years. Thorne was ex-military, fiercely loyal, and surgically precise in his work. "Thorne," Julian said when the man answered, "I need everything you can find on Caroline Williams. Past aliases, previous addresses, employment history. I especially need anything that connects her to the last 2 weeks of Amelia's life. Something is very wrong here, and I need proof." "On it," Thorne replied. "Give me 48 hours." Julian hung up and looked across the expansive house toward Leo's room. He could hear the faint, cheerful sounds of a cartoon. It was one Amelia had always pretended to dislike but secretly enjoyed. His chest tightened. Caroline had not returned since their confrontation. Her belongings were still upstairs, but her car was gone. She was lying low, being strategic, and that made her all the more dangerous. He didn't believe in ghosts, but that night he found the last voice memo Amelia had ever recorded for him and played it in the dark. "Hey, my love. If you're listening to this, it means I didn't get to say goodbye the way I wanted. I'm so sorry, but I need you to be strong. Not just for Leo, but for yourself. There will come a time when your gut tells you something is wrong, when your heart says one thing and your mind says another. Trust your instincts and protect our boy. I will always be with you." He closed his eyes. She had known. She had seen this coming. And now, Julian would ensure that her last, desperate warning was heard. By morning, the war would officially begin. 2 days later, Julian met Marcus Thorne in a quiet, nondescript coffee shop on the outskirts of Pacific Palisades. It was the kind of place where the regulars kept to themselves, and the servers refilled your cup without making small talk. Thorne, a weathered man in a leather jacket, who looked more like a roadie for a rock band than a private investigator, slid into the booth opposite him. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes told Julian everything he needed to know. "You're not going to like what I found," Thorne said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "I already don't like what I know," Julian replied, plugging the drive into his tablet. "Caroline Williams isn't her real name," Thorne began. "Her birth name is Erica Vance. She's changed her identity twice in the last decade. The first time was in Ohio, after she was investigated for financial fraud involving an elderly widower. The charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. The second alias surfaced after a quiet, out-of-court settlement with a hospice facility in Nevada. She was working as a grief companion, and 2 of her clients died under unusual circumstances." Julian remained impassive, but a vein pulsed in his temple. "She targets vulnerable families," Thorne continued. "Terminally ill spouses, grieving parents, significant wealth. She embeds herself in their lives, always operating just below the radar. No official employment records, just proximity. And somehow," Julian said slowly, "she always ends up with access to the assets." Thorne nodded. "She's a phantom. Smart, manipulative, leaves no paper trail. But she slipped up once. She filed a power of attorney form in Nevada using forged signatures. The case was sealed, but I managed to dig up the court records. If we can get a handwriting expert to match her signature on that document to the visitor log at St. Jude's, we'll have a direct link." Julian stared at the screen, scrolling through the documents Thorne had unearthed. There were photographs, scanned legal papers, even a faded copy of a birth certificate bearing her original name. It was all there, a breadcrumb trail leading through a decade of deception. "And Amelia?" Julian asked, his voice tight. "Was she connected to the Nevada case?" Thorne paused. One of the deceased patients was a woman named Maria Flores. Ovarian cancer. Died a month after Caroline began visiting her at the hospice. Maria's son later told investigators that his mother's health had been stabilizing before she took a sudden, rapid decline. But the case went cold. Julian exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. The pieces were falling into place. "This isn't just about Leo anymore," he muttered. "This woman is a predator." Thorne leaned forward. "I can take this to a contact I have in the DA's office, but without definitive medical proof of foul play, they might be slow to act. If you want to control the narrative, you need to strike first, legally and publicly. Use the media if you have to." "I'll start with custody," Julian said, his mind already mapping out the strategy. "I'll file an emergency motion, present the evidence of abuse, the falsified medical logs, the forged signatures. Then, we go after her aliases. If I can prove fraud in one state, her credibility will be shattered." "This will get ugly," Thorne warned. "She won't go down without a fight." Julian looked him directly in the eye. "Neither will I." By the end of the week, Julian's legal team had filed a sealed motion for emergency custody and a temporary restraining order, citing suspected emotional abuse and medical fraud. His lead attorney, a sharp, relentless woman in her 60s named Eleanor Vance, had been his corporate counsel for over a decade. She had a no-nonsense demeanor and an allergy to liars. "We're walking a fine line here, Julian," Eleanor told him over a video call. "If the court perceives this as a wealthy man using his resources to weaponize a custody dispute, it could backfire spectacularly." "This isn't about winning a legal battle," Julian said. "This is about saving my son." Eleanor nodded once. "Good, because we're in front of Judge Alistair Finch, and he has zero tolerance for theatrics." As the hearing date was set, Julian took one more crucial step. He sat down with Leo in the backyard, under the shade of the large oak tree Amelia had loved. The late afternoon sun dappled the grass, and Leo was curled up in a blanket, sipping a juice box. "I need to ask you something important," Julian said, kneeling beside him. "And it's okay if you don't want to answer." Leo looked at him, his expression calm and trusting. When Caroline was angry, Julian asked gently, "Did she ever go through Mommy's things? Did she ever take anything from her boxes?" Leo thought for a moment. "One time, I saw her reading Mommy's journal, the one with the blue leather cover." Julian blinked. "Amelia's journal?" "She kept it in her closet," Leo said. "But then, one day, it was gone." The journal. Julian remembered it well. Amelia had filled its pages during her final months. It had been her private sanctuary, a place for thoughts too raw even for him. And now it was missing. He stood up abruptly and went inside, heading straight for the master bedroom closet. Amelia's belongings were still there, neatly stored in the back. Her favorite cashmere scarf, a bottle of her perfume, a stack of worn poetry books. But the journal was gone. He searched through boxes, drawers, even under the bed. Nothing. He called Thorne again. "I need you to search one more place," he said. "Caroline has a storage unit. She mentioned it once, said she kept her seasonal wardrobe there." "Already on it," Thorne replied. "I tailed her to a facility in Van Nuys last week. She has a unit registered under the name CW Enterprises. You want me to get a warrant?" Julian paused. No, I'll meet you there tomorrow. That night, as the house fell silent, Julian sat in Amelia's favorite armchair and stared into the crackling fireplace. Leo was asleep, his breathing soft and steady from down the hall. Every decision Julian made from this point forward would shape the rest of his son's life. And the full truth, he could feel it now, was tantalizingly close, breathing just beneath the surface. The next morning, Julian met Thorne in the dusty, sun-bleached parking lot of a nondescript storage facility in Van Nuys. The place was a maze of identical beige metal doors, stretching out in every direction under the harsh California sun. Thorne was leaning against his unremarkable sedan, sipping a cup of coffee and surveying the area with the practiced ease of a man who was used to waiting in the shadows. "She was here late last night," Thorne said as Julian got out of his car. "Parked right by Unit 314, stayed inside for about an hour, came out with a small box, locked up, and drove off in that white SUV of hers." Julian glanced at the unit number. "Did you get a look at what she was carrying?" Thorne handed him his phone. The photo was taken from a distance, grainy and shrouded in shadow, but it was clear enough. A rectangular box, bound in worn leather, a familiar shade of deep blue. "Amelia's journal," Julian muttered. "That's it." Thorne nodded. "Figured? You want in?" Thorne grinned faintly and produced a small, sophisticated lock-picking kit from his jacket pocket. "You didn't ask, but I came prepared." Within seconds, they were standing before the corrugated steel door of Unit 314. Thorne knelt, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision. With a soft, satisfying click, the lock disengaged. Julian felt a slow, heavy pulse in his chest, a mixture of dread and grim determination. The metal door rolled upward with a protesting groan. The air inside the unit was stale, smelling faintly of dust and lavender. Amelia's signature scent, now corrupted by time and deceit. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, all neatly labeled in Caroline's precise, elegant script. Winter clothes, tax records, old photographs, Leo's artwork, and then, in the back corner, Amelia, estate. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He stepped inside. There was another box, tucked behind the labeled ones, its flaps slightly ajar. He walked toward it and lifted the top. Inside were more of Amelia's personal effects, medical files, photo albums, and several other journals. Lying next to them were two small amber-colored pill bottles. One had a faded prescription label. The other was completely unmarked. He picked up the unmarked bottle. "Lorazepam," Julian whispered, reading the small print on the identical labeled bottle. "Same dosage I found on Amelia's charts. This was never part of her official treatment." Thorne came up behind him. "That unmarked bottle. It looks like it's from a specific batch that was recalled after a hospice investigation in Nevada. They stopped using those child-proof caps after a patient was accidentally overdosed." Julian stared at the bottle. "She brought it with her, across state lines." "Which makes it a federal offense," Thorne confirmed. "Possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, potentially to a vulnerable person." Julian took out his phone and began documenting everything, photographing every file, every bottle, every page of the journals he could access without disturbing the potential evidence. She took Amelia's memories, her final words, her truth, and locked them away in this place, Julian said, his voice low and sharp with fury. "She never intended for anyone to find this." "She underestimated you," Thorne replied. They backed out of the unit, closed the door, and Thorne resecured the lock, leaving it exactly as they had found it. Julian scanned the empty parking lot, half expecting Caroline to materialize from behind a vehicle, her smile as false as her name. But the lot remained eerily still. the world outside oblivious to the quiet war being waged within its walls. On the drive back to Malibu, Julian kept one hand clenched on the steering wheel, the other resting on the passenger seat, where a digital copy of Amelia's primary journal now resided on a flash drive. He hadn't read it yet. He wasn't sure he could, not while navigating traffic. But one entry from the first page, which Thorne had quickly scanned, was already burned into his mind. I want to believe she cares for me, but some days I feel like she's studying me, not to help me, but to learn my breaking points. That night, while Leo slept soundly and the house was once again filled with the soft, rhythmic sigh of the ocean, Julian sat in his office and read. Page after page, Amelia had chronicled not just the progression of her illness, but her growing fears and suspicions. She had noted the subtle, bitter aftertaste in the tea Caroline brought her. She had documented a blackout she'd experienced after a late-night dose of medication she didn't remember asking for. She had found her pill bottles rearranged in her medicine cabinet. She had written down every single unsettling moment. If I die, Julian, and you are reading this, trust your instincts, and do not let Leo grow up without knowing who I truly was. Not the woman in the photographs, but the woman in these pages. Julian closed the journal, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Caroline hadn't just manipulated Amelia, she had been slowly, methodically erasing her. And now, Julian held the trail of breadcrumbs Amelia had so painstakingly left behind. This was no longer suspicion. It was proof. He picked up his phone and dialed Eleanor Vance. "Tell the judge we're amending our motion," he said. "We now have evidence of suspected medical fraud, identity theft, and potential manslaughter." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jesus, Julian, that's a hell of an escalation. I want Leo's safety guaranteed. I want her legally barred from coming anywhere near him before she has a chance to play the victim. And when this is over, I want her prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Not for me, for Amelia." Eleanor's voice softened. "Understood. I'll have everything in motion by morning." After hanging up, Julian walked down the hall and peeked into Leo's room. The boy was curled on his side, clutching a stuffed wolf. The silver locket around his neck glinted in the soft glow of the nightlight. He whispered, more to himself than to the sleeping child, "I'm going to fix this, buddy. No more secrets. No more shadows." For the first time in weeks, Julian didn't feel helpless. He felt a cold, clear focus. The storm was coming, and this time he would be ready for it. The courtroom was a cold, imposing space, paneled in dark oak, and steeped in a silence that felt heavy with judgment. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a storm, thick with anticipation. Julian sat at the plaintiff's table beside Eleanor Vance, the air between them taut with the gravity of the moment. To their right, Leo sat with a court-appointed child advocate, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Gable. He clutched his favorite stuffed wolf, its ears worn smooth from years of anxious hugs. Across the aisle sat Caroline, her blonde hair styled in a sleek, elegant chignon, her pearl earrings gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She wore a conservative gray suit and an expression of manufactured composure, as if she were the aggrieved party in a regrettable misunderstanding. Her lawyer, Arthur Vance, shuffled through a file with an air of cool detachment, but Julian noted the subtle tension in the man's shoulders. Judge Alistair Finch entered the courtroom, a tall, imposing man with a shock of silver hair and the weary eyes of someone who had heard every lie imaginable. Everyone rose. Julian's gaze remained locked on Caroline. When they were seated, the judge spoke, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention. "This is a hearing on an emergency motion for the protection of the minor, Leo Croft. I have reviewed the submitted documents, and I understand there are allegations of a serious nature. Let us proceed with clarity and efficiency." Eleanor stood, her voice calm but carrying the quiet authority of a seasoned litigator. "Your Honor, we are requesting an immediate and full revocation of all custodial and visitation rights for Caroline Williams, based on credible evidence of emotional abuse, medical misconduct, and identity fraud. We have submitted for the record documented medication irregularities from the deceased, Amelia Croft, multiple instances of identity falsification, and a pattern of behavior indicative of long-term predatory manipulation." Judge Finch raised an eyebrow. "That is a formidable list of accusations, Counselor. Do you have the documentation to support them?" Eleanor nodded. "Submitted under Exhibits B through G, Your Honor. This includes testimony from Dr. Evans, the child's therapist, photographs of controlled substances found in Ms. Williams's possession that were never prescribed to the deceased, hospital visitor logs showing a falsified identity, and a personal journal kept by Amelia Croft that explicitly states her suspicion of medical interference." Arthur Vance rose slowly, adjusting his tie as if he had all the time in the world. "Your Honor, with all due respect, what we are witnessing here is grief. Grief that has been weaponized. Mr. Croft is a man who tragically lost his wife and is now struggling to cope with his son's disability. While heartbreaking, this does not justify this character assassination of my client without a shred of hard evidence. The pills were never professionally tested. The journal could have been written at any time. This is an emotional reaction, not a factual case." Julian gritted his teeth. Eleanor, however, offered a faint, knowing smile. "If it pleases the court," she said, "the court will find in Exhibit F a chain of custody report from an independent lab, verifying that the pills found in Ms. Williams's possession match a specific lot number that was recalled following a separate elder abuse investigation in Nevada. We also have a handwriting analysis from a forensic expert, linking her signature under a known alias to a forged care proxy form used during Mrs. Croft's final days." Vance's complexion paled slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Still circumstantial, Your Honor." "We also have audio recordings," Eleanor interrupted smoothly, "of Ms. Williams verbally berating the minor, captured by a baby monitor that the child had inadvertently left on." A ripple of hushed murmurs went through the courtroom. Caroline's mask of composure finally cracked. A muscle in her jaw twitched, and she looked down at the table, her knuckles white. Judge Finch held up a hand. "Enough. I have heard sufficient preliminary evidence to warrant an emergency restriction. Ms. Williams, until a full investigation can be conducted, your access to Leo Croft is hereby suspended. You are ordered to maintain a distance of no less than 500 feet from the child's residence, school, and any associated medical facilities." Caroline's head snapped up. "You can't be serious." The judge looked down at her from the bench, his expression unyielding. "I have been more than patient, Ms. Williams. You will have your day in court. But for now, the safety of a child is my paramount concern." Caroline stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a witch hunt. He's doing this because I was the only one who knew the truth about his wife. Amelia was unstable. She begged for my help." "Ms. Williams," the judge warned, his voice dangerously low, "you are approaching contempt of court." But Julian didn't hear the rest. His attention was fixed on Leo, who had turned to look at him, The boy's eyes were wide, his grip on the stuffed wolf tighter than ever. He didn't understand the legal jargon, but he understood the feeling of relief. He understood the promise of safety. Outside the courthouse, Caroline descended the steps like a queen in exile, her face a mask of cold fury as a handful of tabloid photographers, tipped off to a high-profile dispute, swarmed her. Julian didn't care. Let them take their pictures. Let the world see the beginning of the unraveling. Eleanor walked beside him. The next step is the criminal case. Once we hand this file over to the district attorney, it becomes much bigger than family court. I want her held accountable, Julian said. No more quiet settlements. No more disappearing acts. You might just get your wish, Eleanor replied. That bottle of pills alone is enough to trigger a federal investigation. Add the journal, the audio recording, the aliases. She's facing a mountain of trouble. As they reached his car, Julian paused. Eleanor, Amelia left those clues. She knew. She trusted you would find them. He nodded. She just didn't know how much of myself I'd have to lose to follow them. He turned, opened the car door, and helped Leo into his seat. The boy looked up at him, his small voice breaking the silence. Is she gone? For now, yes, Julian said softly. And she's not coming back. Leo looked down at his stuffed wolf and whispered, Mommy would be proud. Julian swallowed the lump in his throat, brushed a stray hair from his son's forehead, and gently closed the door. As he started the car, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw his son smiling quietly at the sky. And he knew, for the first time in a very long time, that the road ahead, though still shrouded in darkness, was finally his to illuminate. The days that followed were a strange mixture of calm and chaos. With Caroline gone and the emergency custody order in place, a palpable sense of relief settled over the house. It felt lighter, as if a window that had been sealed shut for years had finally been thrown open. Leo began to laugh more, his appetite returned, and he even asked to go back to his swim therapy, something he hadn't shown interest in since before Amelia's final decline. But Julian didn't allow himself to relax. He spent his days in the study, the files and evidence spread across his desk like a complex, grim puzzle. The deeper Thorne dug into Caroline's past, the more tangled the web of deceit became. Each new discovery, however, was another step up the ladder, another move out of the shadows Caroline had cast over his family. That morning, Thorne sent him a new lead. The subject line of the email was chilling. A name that shouldn't exist. The attachment was a scanned copy of a birth certificate. It belonged to a woman named Clara Hayes, born in 1978 in rural Oregon. A quick cross-reference showed that Clara had died at the age of 15 in a tragic house fire. There were no surviving family members, but in 2009, someone using Clara's Social Security number had applied for and received a caregiver certification in the state of Arizona. The photo on the ID was unmistakably Caroline. She stole a dead girl's identity, Julian muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. This was how she had stayed a ghost for so long. No criminal record, no driver's license, just a series of borrowed names. He called Thorne immediately. I want everything you can find on Clara Hayes, Julian said. Every job application, every address on file. I don't care if it was over a decade ago. Thorne's voice was calm but tight. Already on it. But there's something else. What? I think she's planning to run. A contact I have at LAX just flagged a booking. A one-way ticket to Belize, departing in 48 hours. The name on the ticket is Vanessa Hale. Julian froze. Does she know we're closing in? The court records were sealed, but someone might have tipped her off from inside that law firm she uses. Either way, she's preparing to vanish. "Not this time," Julian said, his voice hard as steel. "Not after what she's done. We stop her before she can disappear again." Durons, that afternoon, Julian and Eleanor met with Detective Miller, a sharp, no-nonsense LAPD officer who had taken a personal interest in the case after the Department of Child and Family Services shared their findings. Miller was in her late 40s, with a weary but determined look in her eyes. "This woman has slipped through a lot of cracks," she said, flipping through the binder of evidence Eleanor had compiled. "She's clever, careful, and legally adept at exploiting loopholes. But this—" She tapped the printout of the stolen identity. "This gives us a federal charge with some serious teeth." Eleanor leaned in. "Can we get a warrant issued before she boards that plane?" Miller nodded. "If we can confirm she's using that alias at the airport and tie it to her flight, yes. But I need real-time confirmation that she's actively using that false identity." Julian exhaled slowly. "How do we do that without tipping her off?" A rare, thin smile touched Miller's lips. "Let me worry about that." That night, Julian stood on the back terrace, the vast expanse of the starry sky above him, the ocean breeze cool against his skin. He held Amelia's journal, rereading her final entry. "If this is the last thing I write, I want Leo to know that he is made of starlight, and that I was not afraid to leave this world because I trusted his father would protect that light for me." He closed the journal and pressed it to his chest. "I'm trying," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm trying to be the man you believed I was." A sound from the sliding glass door made him turn. Leo stood there in his pajamas, clutching his stuffed wolf. His eyes were heavy with sleep, but calm. "I dreamed about Mommy," he said softly. Julian knelt down. "Oh yeah? What was the dream about?" "She was sitting on my bed," Leo said. "She didn't say anything, but she smiled. And I knew everything was going to be okay." Julian felt his throat tighten. "She's always watching over you, buddy." Leo nodded, and then stepped into his father's arms. Julian held him there for a long time, the small, warm weight of his son, a grounding presence against the vastness of the night. The next morning, Detective Miller called, her tone leaving no room for ambiguity. "She's on the move. We have confirmation from TSA surveillance. Caroline Williams arrived at LAX an hour ago, checked in under the name Vanessa Hale. She's flying first class to Belize on the 9:10 p.m. flight." Eleanor's voice came over the speakerphone. "We have the court order signed and ready. Miller, can you intercept her before she boards?" "I'm coordinating with airport security as we speak," Miller said. "I need you both to stay clear of this, for your own safety. She's cornered, and that makes her unpredictable." Julian gripped the edge of his desk. "Just don't let her get on that plane." "We won't," Miller assured him. "By the time she reaches her gate, the only thing waiting for her will be a pair of handcuffs." The hours that followed crawled by, each minute a heavy weight on Julian's chest. He checked his phone obsessively, even though it remained silent. Eleanor sent text updates from her end. Thorne sent last-minute confirmations tying Caroline to the death of the widower in Ohio under the Clara Hayes alias. Then, at exactly 9:12 p.m., his phone finally lit up. It was Miller. "She's in custody." Julian exhaled so forcefully he felt lightheaded, slumping back into the chair behind him. It was over. Caroline Williams, Erica Vance, Clara Hayes, Vanessa Hale. She was no longer a phantom haunting the corners of his life. She was a criminal, apprehended, and facing a wall of charges so high it would take a lifetime to climb over. The next morning, the story broke. Former socialite, arrested at LAX under stolen identity, linked to suspicious deaths in multiple states. Photos of Caroline's mugshot flashed across the news. Legal analysts speculated about a wider conspiracy. But for Julian, the world had suddenly grown quiet again. And for the first time since Amelia's death, he allowed himself to feel a fragile, unfamiliar emotion: hope. Justice had finally begun its slow, inexorable march forward. The holding room at the Los Angeles County Detention Center was a sterile, soulless space that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold, unflattering glow on everything. Julian sat at a narrow metal table, his hands folded, his posture rigid. On the other side of a thick pane of reinforced glass sat Caroline. She looked diminished without her designer suit and pearls. Dressed in a drab gray jumpsuit, her hair unkempt, her eyes flickering with a mixture of exhaustion and impotent rage, she was almost unrecognizable. The mask she had worn for years was gone, and what was left was ugly and raw. Julian picked up the phone on his side of the glass. She stared at him for a long moment before lifting hers, pressing it to her ear as if it were made of lead. "Did you come to gloat?" she asked, her voice a hoarse rasp. "No," Julian said, his voice even. "I came to see if there was anything left of the woman my wife once called a friend." Caroline let out a single, sharp, bitter laugh. "Your wife was lonely. I was a good listener. That's all it was. You were there to exploit her. She chose to depend on me. I didn't force her to do anything. You forged her signature on medical documents. You manipulated her treatment. You isolated her from anyone who might have seen through your act." Her lips curled into a sneer. She was dying. Everyone knew it. I just helped her find peace. You're angry because I made it clean." Julian's blood ran cold. "You admit it?" "What does it matter now?" she whispered, her voice dropping. "You've already ruined me. I might as well own it." He stared at her, his heart a heavy, thudding drum in his chest. It wasn't just the crime itself. It was the absolute, chilling lack of remorse. The soulless void in her voice. She didn't regret her actions, only the fact that she had been caught. "I loved her," Julian said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And you used that love as a weapon against her." Caroline scoffed. "You loved your work, your galas, your name on the side of a building. You weren't there at 3 in the morning when she couldn't breathe. I was." Julian leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "You were there because you were making her sick. You were there because you wanted her to be dependent on you. And now you are here because she trusted me to protect our son from predators like you." For a fleeting second, something in Caroline's eyes cracked, a sliver of vulnerability, or perhaps just the raw terror of finally being powerless. "She called me her sister," she whispered. "No," Julian said softly. "She called you a mistake. I read every word in her journal." Caroline's hand trembled slightly before she slammed the phone back into its cradle and stood up. A guard appeared instantly behind her. As she was led away, she didn't look back. Back at home, the media storm only intensified. National news networks picked up the story. Amelia's name was now spoken with a reverence she had never sought in life. Beloved philanthropist, devoted mother, tragic victim. Julian found himself giving carefully worded interviews, his tone measured, his grief a shield. But the real story wasn't for the cameras. It was for Leo. One evening after dinner, Julian sat on the living room floor, while Leo worked on a new model airplane nearby. He watched his son in silence. The quiet concentration on the boy's face, a poignant echo of Amelia's focus in her art studio. "Daddy?" Leo said, without looking up. "Yeah, buddy? Is the bad lady going to stay in jail for a long time?" Julian swallowed. "That's what everyone is working on, to make sure she can never hurt anyone again." Leo nodded thoughtfully. "Good. I had a dream that she tried to take me away." Julian reached over and placed a hand gently on his son's back. "That will never happen. I promise you, she is not coming back." "She said Mommy didn't love me," Leo whispered, the words so quiet Julian almost missed them. Julian froze. "What?" "She told me once that Mommy was too tired to love me anymore. That's why she went away." Julian gently pulled Leo into his lap. "That is the biggest lie in the world. Mommy loved you more than anything, buddy. So much that she left us a map to make sure I could keep you safe, even after she was gone." Leo looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "She did," Julian nodded. "And I think Mommy would want me to show you something soon. Her journal. Will it make me sad? Maybe a little, but it will also make you feel close to her, like she's still here, talking to you." Leo was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." They sat together as the sun set, bathing the room in a warm, amber light. Julian thought about the long road ahead. Therapy, court dates, the endless paperwork of a life being rebuilt. But for now, they had this moment of stillness, and that was enough. A week later, Julian met with Eleanor at her downtown office. She looked more relaxed than he'd seen her in months, a rare smile playing on her lips. "We got confirmation from the DA's office," she said. "They're moving forward with a full slate of charges: identity fraud, forgery, medical abuse, and potential manslaughter. The journal and the pill records were the final nails in the coffin." Julian exhaled. "Good. And Leo's custody, permanent guardianship, has been granted to you? No more interim hearings. It's done." He nodded, a wave of emotion rising in his chest that he kept tightly in check. "There's more," Eleanor added, sliding a folder across the table. This came from an old social worker in Ohio. Apparently, Amelia's death wasn't Caroline's first suspected case of this kind of manipulation. There was a similar situation with an elderly widower. The charges never stuck, but the pattern is undeniable. The DA is now building a case that includes multiple victims. Julian flipped through the folder. Photographs, affidavits, a pattern of predatory behavior stretching back nearly 2 decades. How did she keep getting away with it? Eleanor shook her head. Systemic failures, sealed settlements, and because good people like Amelia gave her the benefit of the doubt. "Not anymore," Julian said. "No more shadows." As he stood to leave, Eleanor added, "You've done something most people never have to. You fought a ghost and won. That takes a different kind of strength." He smiled faintly. "I didn't do it alone." Outside, the sky was a soft autumnal gold. He looked up, letting the breeze cool his face. The truth was no longer a buried secret. Caroline's mask had been ripped away, and Julian was finally free to begin again, not in the shadow of his grief, but in the light of justice.